Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Start of Part 2 of Chapter 20, Uqba's invasion of the Maghreb. Uqba had fought his way through the provinces of Africa, Numidia and Mauritania, which were part of the Roman Empire ruled from Constantinople. His enemies had been the Romans and the Berbers. Now he was in Tangier, which was part of Gothic Spain. This was a different imperial world, and this was the first time that the Muslims were coming in contact with this world. The early Muslim geographers noted that the people of Tangier were known for their lack of intelligence, but there was nothing stupid about Count Julian, the governor of the province. According to Marrakushi and most modern historians, this man was a Gothic noble acting as governor of the province of Tangier at Sabta on behalf of the King of Spain. Ibn Khaldun, however, says that his name was Yalian, could be Arabicized from Julian, or Balian or Balban, that he was a Berber king of the tribe of Ghamara, living in the Ghamara mountains in this region, that he inclined towards and had sworn allegiance to the King of Spain, and that he ruled the province as a vassal of the Goths. General J.F.C. Fuller, the famous British military historian of our time, gives his name as Julian or Olban and considers that he was probably a Christian Berber. Whoever and whatever he was, Julian alias Yalian, alias Balian, alias Balban, alias Olban, was one of the most cunning of men. He lost no time in offering Uqba a bait which the simple warrior swallowed, hook, line, and sinker. Julian was terrified of facing the advancing Muslims, having heard how the fierce and proud tribes of Berbers, whom the Romans and Goths feared to clash with, had been broken to pieces whenever they rose to impede the Muslim advance. Julian knew that he and his army of Goths and Berbers could only oppose the Muslims at the cost of their lives. Uqba's fame as an irresistible commander and a dauntless warrior had preceded him. Tangier and all who lived in the province trembled at the approach of this new conqueror from the desert of Arabia. Julian at once switched to diplomacy. He sent an embassy with gifts to Uqba before the latter got to Tangier. The ambassador asked for peace and offered submission. Julian and all those who lived in Tangier would come under Muslim rule and accept whatever terms were laid down by the commander. All they wanted was peace and friendship. Uqba accepted the offer and marched to the city of Tangier, approaching it as a city inhabited by a friendly people and loyal subjects. It was all very nice and peaceful. Julian received the Muslim commander and made much of him. Since he had submitted, there was no question of Uqba fighting him. He had got the city without bloodshed, having marched 1,000 miles from Caravan to get it. Uqba asked Julian about Andalusia. It appears that he was the first Muslim general with the ideas of conquering Spain, but Julian deflected him gently, turned him southwards, where more Berbers and the most terrible Berbers lived. "You have left the Romans behind you," said Julian. "There is none in front of you but Berbers. They are like animals. They will not enter Christianity or any other faith. They eat carrion. They eat the flesh of their cattle and drink their blood from the neck. They disbelieve in the great God and do not know him. And the most powerful of them are the Masamida." In much the same way might an Indian officer advise the British as they made their way to the northwest frontier of India in the middle of the 19th century, have warned them to beware of the tribes of Mahsuds and Wazirs. But Julian was not warning Uqba. He was tempting him, egging him on. The Goths were afraid to fight the Berber tribes of the High Atlas, and tried always to keep them at arm's length and in a reasonable state of satisfaction. Julian now hoped to kill two birds with one stone. He would have the Berbers beaten into submission without himself getting involved, and would weaken or break the Muslim power. Thus ended the new threat to the Spanish provinces which he governed. If he had his way, the two enemies of Spain would fight each other, weaken each other, and perhaps destroy each other in the process. We do not know if the wily count made an actual pact with Uqba or the extent to which he came under Muslim rule. We know that he submitted and asked for peace, and Uqba accepted his submission. Historians speak of Uqba conquering Tangier without bloodshed. It was probably some loose kind of arrangement which broke up as soon as the Muslim army moved out of sight. Julian's strategy worked beautifully, and Uqba fell into his trap. Fired by zeal at the prospect of a new challenge from the unbeliever, and finding no infidel willing to fight him in Tangier, Uqba turned south and advanced into the mountains of Daran to fight the terrible tribe of Masamida. He was a knight of Islam seeking the pleasure of Allah. Uqba first went and took Walili, a town between the present Fez and Meknes. He then marched on to the mountains of Daran to fight the Masamida. The Masamida, plural of Masmuda, were a large and powerful tribe comprising four main subdivisions, namely Dagag, Asad, Kutama, and Bani Samghara, each fiercer and more violent than the other. The Ghamnara, of which Julian was chief, if he was indeed a Berber and not a Gothic, was also part of his tribal group. The Masamida had remained unconquered for centuries in their mountain fastnesses, and this had bred in the tribe a fierce pride and a jealous suspicion of any intruder who might enter their area. They were brave, warlike, tenacious, and possessed the alertness of a tribe always at war. They were the most bloodthirsty and most dangerous of the Berber tribes of the High Atlas. They owned and occupied the mountains of Daran in the province of Sus al-Adna. There were sections of the Masamida living in Buna and Sabta also, but the major part of this tribe, which Uqba would now clash with, lived in the mountains of Daran. This was the name then used for the mountains which comprise the center of the High Atlas. That is the highest part of what is now called the Atlas Range, with peaks often rising to above 10,000 feet. The name Atlas appears to have come into use later, as no early Muslim historian or geographer has used it. West of these mountains, the coastal plain gently came down to the sea, on a broad front from Tangier in the north to the desert in the south, and this was the best and richest part of what is now Morocco. There were two provinces of Sus in the western part of the Maghreb, comprising the Atlantic seaboard, Sus al-Adna, the nearer Sus, and Sus al-Aqsa, the farther Sus. The northern one was the Sus al-Adna, and included Tangier within its boundaries. It ran down to about where Marrakesh was built later, and it spread to the southeast to include the High Atlas and its foothills bordering the desert. Farther southwest lay the province of Sus al-Aqsa, which ended where the desert began. A strategist would have marched along the coastal plain of the Atlantic seaboard. This plain offered the most suitable terrain for offensive movement. It was the richest part of the country, with the kind of land an invader likes to get hold of. It had the best communications for military movement. After its occupation, the invading general could deal with the difficult tribes from a position of strength, take his time, let them take their time, even leave them to enjoy their high, wild mountains. Above all, the general would avoid getting into these mountains because they formed the most difficult region for offensive maneuver. But the high, wild mountains were just the region into which Uqbabinnafe plunged with his hardy warriors. Uqba's tactical handling of battle against the Romans and Berbers had been excellent. He had won every one of those battles. He obviously knew his stuff as a battlefield commander. But either he was no strategist or he deliberately ignored strategical requirements, for the sake of what he considered the overriding objective of earning merit with Allah by fighting infidels. The unbelieving Masamida were there, and that is where he would go. If strategy did not like what he was doing, strategy could. Uqba would soon learn that strategy could not be ignored all that lightly, and that an army breaks the principles of war only at the peril of its life. The Masamida were awaiting for him. They saw him coming. They may even have been warned of his approach by the crafty Julian. They led him on. They met him as he entered their tribal area, offering a little opposition in order not to arouse his suspicions, falling back into their high mountains, never too fast, drawing him on deeper and deeper into the mountains, farther and farther from the plains. And the Muslim warriors, most of whom were from the hot, dry desert, went blithely up the cold, wet mountains without pausing to reflect. Once they were up at the highest levels of the hills of Daran, the Berbers stopped their retrograde movement. They had got the Muslims where they wanted them. Fast-moving bodies of Berbers closed in on the Muslim flanks, while others cut in behind them to sever their line of withdrawal. The Muslims found themselves in occupation of a high part of the mountainous area, with the Berbers all around them, holding the passes and the routes through which human movement could take place. The tribesmen took up a string of positions, their very selection of ground making it difficult for anyone to attack and dislodge them. The Muslims were now besieged. Luckily for the Muslims, it was summer time, about midsummer of 682. It was still pleasant for desert dwellers to be in the cold mountains, but it would have been much worse if the whole action had been delayed and taken place in the autumn. As they were now placed, the autumn might come upon them if they were lucky enough to survive till then. The Muslims did not have much in the way of supplies. The mountainous region in which they were confined offered very little in the way of food and fodder, and foraging parties could not go far because of the Berber blockade. A decisive result would have to be gained one way or the other before many weeks had passed. This was a most unusual siege. It was more of a blockade. It had been brilliantly contrived by the Berbers who had led the Muslims into the mountainous area, and then formed a ring around them to prevent reinforcement and escape, and to starve them into submission. The Berbers had no intention of attacking the Muslims. They knew that it would be folly to do so. If they could just hold the Muslims within the ring, prevent their getting out and stop food getting in, they would starve them into submission or starve them to death. It was a siege, but without forts, without towers and without engines of war. The Muslims were vastly outnumbered by the Masamida, who occupied every hilltop and sat across every track. Uqba realized how he had been led into the trap and reacted with characteristic violence to break the Berber blockade. He launched fierce attacks against the Berber positions, but all his attacks were repulsed. The Masamida had heard what had happened to their brothers at the hands of Uqba, and were determined not only to avoid their fate, but also to take revenge for what their brothers had suffered. No mercy would be shown. The vengeance of the Berber was no less terrible than the vengeance of the Arab. Uqba continued to launch his attacks to break the Berber hold on the mountain fortress, but without success, and so this unusual operation wore on. The Berbers would not come in, the Muslims could not get out. Supplies were running out. There was no question of surrender. In the first place, Uqba was eager for martyrdom. In the second place, the Berbers would slaughter them anyway. When the supplies ran out, the end would come, and the mountains of Daran would see a lot of martyrs going up to heaven. Belatedly, Uqba realized that it was easier to get inside a hostile tribal area than to get out of it. It is a feature of tribal life that when not fighting outsiders, the tribes fight each other, clan against clan within the tribe, tribe against tribe within the land. This happens everywhere in all tribal societies, in all races of men. Local feuds are kept alive by the vindictive nature of the tribal character, and it takes little to fan the flames, which never go out anyway. So it was the Berber tribes of the Maghreb, in the two provinces known as Sus. There were three large tribes in the region, namely the Masamida, the Zannata, and the Sinhaja, the last of which, according to Ibn Khaldun, was probably not Berber at all. These tribes often fought one another, having nothing better to do. The Masamida and the Zannata were particularly acrimonious in their hostility towards each other. They would never let an opportunity slip to inflict damage upon the other, especially when the other tribe was vulnerable. This was part of the tribal game. It was when the Muslims had abandoned hope of breaking out of the Berber ring and had reconciled themselves to a bitter and bloody end that the Zannata fell upon the Masamida. They struck at their traditional enemies in a beautifully chosen moment of vulnerability, and the Masamida, who had been exulting till the day before at the plight of the Muslims and the prospects of winning a heroic victory against a powerful army, plus vast plunder, now found themselves shattered by attacks launched by their tribal enemies from behind, while frontally they were struggling to repulse Muslim attempts at breaking out. The shock effect on the Masamida mind of the surprise attack of the Zannata was total. Hardly had the attack begun when the Masamida broke and fled in panic, melting like butter under a hot knife. For the Muslims, this was an 11th hour rescue. Uqba was a superb combat leader. His tactical skill combined with his unflagging spirit and his considerable personal courage and prowess made him the ideal commander on the battlefield. Now again he rose to great heights. While the day before he had little hope of survival, let alone victory, now suddenly he turned fiercely against his enemies. Without a moment's delay he threw his regiments at the fleeing Masamida. The Muslim horse and foot went with gusto into their new role, pursuing and hunting down Berbers in all directions, slaughtering all but those who clearly offered to surrender, ravaging the countryside, and taking what they wished as booty. In this pursuit, the Zannat and the Muslims worked together as allies against the Masamida. For some weeks the clearing operation continued, until all Masamida lands had been subdued and all the Masamida had submitted to Muslim rule. Large numbers accepted Islam at the hands of Uqba, as the Zannata had done in even larger numbers. But while the latter remained true to their new faith, with the Masamida, this conversion was more of a matter of political convenience. The Muslims gathered a great deal of booty. When the troops had sufficiently rested and sufficiently fed, after the privations of their mountainous siege, Uqba decided that it was time to get on with the job of fighting infidels. He marched in a southwesterly direction. He passed peacefully through the land of the Zannata, many of whom joined his army as warriors, and got to the west end of the high Atlas range. About here was the tribal boundary of the Sinhaja. The Sinhaja were an even larger and even more powerful tribe than the Masamida, and were believed to comprise almost a third of the entire Berber nation, though only a part of the tribe lived in the western part of the Maghreb. They were Zoroastrians and were known as people of the veil, because they covered their faces with scarves, with just the eyes showing. They were an extremely good-looking people, in spite of their wild and barbaric nature. The Sinhaja rose to defend their land. They came in countless numbers and fell like flies in their clashes with the Muslims. If fighting in the mountains of the Ran had been fierce, this was even worse. This was the most bloody fighting scene in the Maghreb. Suffering defeat after defeat, the Sinhaja fell back deeper into their area, as the relentless Muslim advance continued. The Berbers were badly beaten in every engagement and lost heavily, and this went on through the valley of the Sus River until Uqba got to the capital of the province of Sus al-Aqsa, a town named Tarudant. The city fell, and the Sinhaja resistance broke. Tarudant lay 40 miles from the sea and became the forward base for Muslim operations. Here Islam was offered and accepted by thousands of Berbers. Preparations were made for future operations and spoils were gathered. Among the spoils were large numbers of Berber women from the Sinhaja tribe, and their beauty left the Arabs spellbound. The likes of such women had not been seen in the world before. It is reported that girls from the Sinhaja sold in slave markets in the east fetched 1,000 gold pieces, and they were much sought after. No opposition remained for the moment in the Maghreb. Uqba had conquered all, unless some to trouble came up between Tarudant and the Atlantic. Uqba would go to the sea, accompanied by a cavalry detachment. He rode to the Atlantic, 40 miles away, to make his historic rendezvous with the Ocean of Darkness, as the Muslims called the Atlantic. The year 62 Hijri was coming to an end. This would be about late summer in 682. The waves of the Atlantic gently lapped the sandy beach, which stretched inland for a considerable distance. A soft breeze blew from the ocean. The place was not far from the present Agadir, perhaps a few miles south. Suddenly a group of horsemen rode onto the beach from the east. They stopped on the beach. For a few minutes their leader looked distantly at the ocean, as if hoping to find some land to break the monotony of the watery horizon. He hesitated for a little while. Then he drove his horse forward. The horse plunged into the sea at a gallop, splashing his way into the blue water. His pace slowed as he went deeper, but the rider forced him on. The rest of the horsemen standing on the beach looked curiously at this strange spectacle, saw the horse's legs disappear in the water. The horse went on till the water had come up to his chest and flowed over the rider's knees. The rider pulled up his horse. He dropped the reins and raised his hands as he looked up at heaven. "O Lord," said Uqbabinnafe, "bear witness that there is no passage. If the sea had not come in my way, I would have gone on in the footsteps of Zulkarnain, defending thy religion, fighting those who disbelieve in thee." This action of Uqba's has inspired Muslims for 13 centuries. It led Iqbal, the poet of the East, to write in his famous poem, The Complaint, "We galloped our horses into the ocean of darkness." This was the farthest that Uqba was to go in his invasion of the Maghreb. He had linked the Indian Ocean with the Atlantic as borders of the Muslim world. He could go no further. This was the farthest that Uqba could go in his military conquest. It was also the farthest, almost, that he would go in life. His end was near, because of the treachery of Kusaila the Berber. End of part 2 of chapter 20.